The slave market on Iskar Prime was a cacophony of sound and light, a place where the desperate and the broken were sold for profit, where no one ever really left with their dignity intact. Axel had seen his fair share of dark places in his time as a smuggler, but none quite like this. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, metal, and fear. Alien species from across the galaxy crowded the auction house, their glances cold, calculating, as they placed their bids on lives, on souls. Axel had always prided himself on staying out of the tangled mess of galactic politics. His job was simple: make the deal, get the goods, and disappear. But today, he found himself in the midst of a transaction that would alter the course of his life forever. The alien princess was the centerpiece of the sale. He hadn't meant to get involved. He'd come to Iskar Prime on a routine delivery, a simple job to drop off some stolen goods to an anonymous buyer. But when the auctioneer had presented her, a young alien woman, shackled and chained like a piece of meat, something in Axel's gut had twisted. She was beautiful, in a way that made his breath catch. The exotic, almost otherworldly features of her face were framed by long, silver hair that shimmered in the dim light. Her eyes, glowing a faint violet hue, scanned the room with a mixture of defiance and resignation. She stood tall, proud, as though she refused to let her captivity define her. But the shackles around her wrists, the chains around her ankles, the collar around her neck, they told a different story. Her name was Princess Nissa of the Vardari. Axel had overheard a couple of dealers talking earlier, and it hadn't taken much to piece together the rest. She had been captured during a raid on her homeworld, sold into slavery by mercenaries who had hoped to ransom her back to her people. But somewhere along the way, they had decided she was too valuable as a commodity. Axel had heard of the Vardari, a powerful and ancient race, and knew enough to recognize that Nissa's status as a princess meant she was worth far more than any other slave on this market. That knowledge, however, didn't make the sight of her any less disturbing. As the auction began, Axel found himself standing near the back, watching the proceedings. He wasn't here to buy anything, certainly not a slave. But there was something about Nissa that pulled at him, something that stirred a feeling he hadn't felt in years, a deep, gnawing sense of justice, of wanting to do something right for once. The auctioneer, a large, burly creature with 8 arms and a thick accent, called out the opening bid. The offers came in quickly, each more obscene than the last. Axel could hear the murmurs of the bidders, voices full of greed and hunger. 5,000 credits, someone shouted from the crowd. 10,000, came the next bid. Axel felt a tightness in his chest. There was no way he could afford this. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a prince in shining armor. He was just a smuggler, a man who did the dirty work, who made deals in the shadows. But the thought of someone, anyone, owning her, treating her as property, made something in him snap. Without thinking, his hand shot up, and his voice rang out through the auction hall. 20,000 credits. The crowd fell silent for a moment. The auctioneer's eyes widened, his 8 arms waving in exaggerated gestures. Ah! We have a bold contender. 20,000. 25. Do I hear 30? Axel's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what he was doing, but the words had left his mouth before he could stop them. He was bidding on an alien princess, and he had just thrown himself into a game he had no business playing. But Nissa's eyes had shifted toward him. For the briefest of moments, their gazes locked, and something passed between them. A flicker of hope? A silent plea? Axel couldn't say, but in that instant, he knew he couldn't back down. The auctioneer's voice grew louder as the bidding continued, but Axel didn't care. He was already too far in. There was no turning back now. 35,000. Axel shouted, his voice steady, though his mind raced. The price continued to climb, but Axel remained firm. His mind worked quickly, weighing the cost against the consequences. He had just placed himself in a position he never expected, but he couldn't let someone like her fall into the hands of the scum in this room. 40,000, came another voice. Axel didn't hesitate. 50,000. His own voice rang out, a declaration he barely understood. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about something else, a sense of doing what was right. The crowd had quieted by now, all eyes on the stage. Axel's bid stood alone, an impossible amount for most of the bidders in the room. The auctioneer looked stunned, his multiple arms twitching as he glanced between Axel and the other potential buyers. Going once, the auctioneer intoned. Going twice. Axel held his breath. His fingers clenched at his side, as if he could will the auction to end. Sold. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the hall. Axel's heart thudded in his chest. He had done it. He had won. The crowd murmured, some in disgust, others in disbelief. Axel's eyes flickered to Nissa as she was led down from the stage. There was no gratitude in her gaze, no warmth. But there was something else, something indefinable. She was free. At least for now. Congratulations, sir, the auctioneer said, his voice dripping with insincerity as he handed Axel a data pad. I'm sure you'll find her, a worthy addition to your collection. Axel felt his stomach churn at the word collection, but he didn't respond. He just nodded, taking the pad from the auctioneer, his eyes never leaving Nissa as she was led toward him, her steps measured, her gaze cold. She had been freed from her chains, but the wariness in her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of her freedom. Axel stepped forward, offering his hand to her, but she looked at it as if it were a snake ready to strike. You don't need to be afraid, Axel said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Nissa's lips twisted into a tight smile. I'm not afraid of you. Axel raised an eyebrow. Then what are you afraid of? She glanced down at her shackles, her eyes hardening. I'm afraid of being used. Of being owned. Axel nodded slowly. I didn't buy you to own you, he said softly. I bought you to free you. She regarded him for a long moment, as though measuring his sincerity. Then, as if deciding he wasn't completely lying, she took a step closer. I'll hold you to that, smuggler, she said, her voice cold but not unkind. Axel couldn't help but smile. You can call me Axel. And if you're staying with me, you can call me whatever you like. Just, don't call me master. Nissa studied him carefully, then nodded. I won't. But you've made a mistake, Axel. He frowned. What mistake? You freed me, she said, a dangerous glint in her eyes. Now you're stuck with me. Axel couldn't help but chuckle at Nissa's words. Stuck with you, he repeated, raising an eyebrow. I don't think I'm the one who's stuck here, princess. She narrowed her violet eyes at him, her gaze sharp and piercing. You freed me. That means you have a responsibility now, Axel. Her voice was cool, but there was something undeniably regal about her, something that made him stand up straighter in her presence. I'm not some prize you collect to show off. I don't belong to anyone. Axel fought the instinct to shrug it off. His entire life had been about making deals, keeping his distance, and walking away from complications. But something about Nissa's defiance struck him deep. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met before. Most people would have been grateful to escape slavery, even if they were still unsure of their next steps. But Nissa? She wasn't asking for his pity or sympathy. She was asserting herself as if she had been the one to free him, not the other way around. I don't expect you to be grateful, but you don't need to remind me every 5 minutes that I'm stuck with you, Axel said, crossing his arms. He tried to keep his tone light, but he was starting to feel the weight of the situation. You're free now, and that's all I care about. You can go wherever you want. Her gaze softened slightly, and for a moment, Axel caught a glimpse of something vulnerable, something she hadn't shown anyone, least of all him. "I'm not used to this," Nissa admitted, her voice quiet. "I've been a prisoner for so long. My people, they betrayed me. And now I'm supposed to trust you? A smuggler?" Axel's heart tightened at the raw honesty in her words. She had been betrayed by her own people, sold into slavery, and now here she was, free, but no less uncertain. The vulnerability that had only flashed for a moment was still there, lingering beneath her proud exterior. He took a step toward her, trying to offer some semblance of reassurance. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said, his voice low. "But I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to make sure you have a chance at freedom. No one should be treated the way you were. And no one should have to live in chains, not even a princess." Her gaze flickered, something close to surprise crossing her features. She looked away quickly, as though embarrassed by her moment of vulnerability. "I didn't ask you to free me," she muttered, as if trying to push the emotions back down. "I never asked anyone to do anything for me." Axel took another step closer, his voice softer now. "You didn't have to ask. I just did it." Nissa remained silent for a long moment, the only sound in the small cabin of the ship the hum of the engines. She crossed her arms, her expression guarded once more. "I don't know what to do now." Axel nodded, understanding more than she realized. "I think we're both in the same boat. I didn't sign up for this either. But we'll figure it out. One step at a time." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. "You're not like them," she said softly, almost to herself. "You're different." Axel raised an eyebrow. "Different from who?" "From the ones who bought me, used me, sold me." She looked away, her voice laced with bitterness. "They thought I was just a tool. Something to be used for their gain." Axel's jaw tightened, the anger that surged through him at the thought of those people selling her flaring briefly. "You're not a tool, Nissa. You're a person. A damn fine one at that." Nissa let out a small, surprised laugh, but it wasn't full of mirth. It was hollow, empty. "I don't even know who I am anymore. All I've known is captivity. And now I'm free, but I don't know what freedom means. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it." Axel took a deep breath, his own thoughts drifting to the confusion he felt about his life. He wasn't a man of many regrets, but he knew that no one ever really taught you how to deal with freedom. Not the kind that came after years of being trapped. "We'll figure it out together," he said, his voice firm but understanding. "I'll help you. I know it's not going to be easy, but you don't have to do it alone." For a moment, Nissa was silent, studying him carefully. Then, without warning, she stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face as though looking for something she couldn't quite name. "Why are you helping me?" Axel hesitated. The truth was simple, but he wasn't sure how to say it. "Because I can," he said, his voice steady. "And because it's the right thing to do." She studied him for another long moment, and then, as if she had made up her mind, nodded. "I don't know what comes next for me. Or for you." She paused, her expression shifting. "But if you're offering help, I'll accept it. For now." Axel was caught off guard by the vulnerability in her voice, a quiet admission of the fear and uncertainty she was facing. It was a stark contrast to the powerful, proud princess who had once commanded entire legions of soldiers. Now, in this moment, she was just another person who had been broken and needed to rebuild herself. Axel nodded. "All right, Nissa. We'll take it one step at a time. First, we get out of here. After that, who knows?" She gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "We'll see, won't we?" Axel smiled back, though it felt strange. "Yeah. We will." The uneasy silence between them lingered, but this time it wasn't the oppressive tension of two people trapped by circumstance. It was the beginning of something else, something neither of them could fully understand, but something that might just change both their lives forever. Outside the window of the ship, the stars seemed distant, cold. But for the first time since he had set foot on Iskar Prime, Axel felt the faintest sense of hope, a glimmer that maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of the darkness together. The cold hum of the engines filled the silence between Axel and Nissa as the ship drifted farther from Iskar Prime. The planet, with its dark markets and darker deals, was fading behind them, but Axel knew they were far from safe. The smugglers and slavers who had run that marketplace would be on their tail, and a trail this hot wouldn't stay cold for long. Axel kept his eyes on the navigational console, his hands steady as he piloted the steel dagger through the vastness of space. Nissa had retreated to the small kitchenette area of the ship, her back turned toward him, but he could still feel her presence. She was restless, and so was he. Their entire situation was built on shaky ground. Axel had always prided himself on having control over his circumstances, he made the deals, he kept moving, he stayed ahead of trouble. But the moment he'd freed Nissa from those shackles, all that control had slipped away. The moment had been impulsive, driven by something Axel had been ignoring for too long, a sense of right versus wrong. And now, here he was, with an alien princess who had spent her life in captivity, uncertain of what freedom even meant, and uncertain of what their next steps should be. Axel, Nissa's voice broke into his thoughts. She stood in the doorway to the cockpit, her posture stiff, her gaze distant. Where are we going? Her question caught him off guard, though he should have known it was coming. He had no clear destination. His mission had always been simple: carry goods, make a deal, and disappear. But now, with her in tow, everything had changed. He turned to face her, trying to maintain the composure that had served him well in tight situations. We're heading to the outer rim, Axel said, keeping his tone even. There's a place there where we can lay low for a while. It's off the grid. No one's going to find us there. She nodded slowly, but there was something in her eyes, something that told Axel she wasn't asking just about the next stop. She was asking about the bigger picture. About them. About what was coming next. You didn't have to free me, she said quietly, her gaze focused on the distant stars outside. I never asked for it. Axel leaned back in his seat, his hands resting on the console. Doesn't matter if you asked or not. It was the right thing to do. He paused, glancing at her, noticing the way her body language stiffened as if she was expecting him to say something else. Something more. But what was there to say? He wasn't the kind of man who made promises he couldn't keep. I don't know what to do with this freedom you've given me, she murmured, almost to herself. Axel raised an eyebrow. I'm not your counselor, Nissa. I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. She turned to him then, her violet eyes sharp. Maybe you should be. I'm not the princess who had everything handed to her, Axel. I'm the one who was betrayed, used, abandoned by everyone. You think this life will be easy? You think I can just walk away from the throne and forget everything? Axel's chest tightened at her words. He knew better than most that escape wasn't just a matter of distance. She wasn't just running from slavers, she was running from a whole life, an identity built on lies and power. Freedom wasn't just about having no chains around her wrists, it was about having no chains in her heart. And that, Axel suspected, was a far heavier burden. You don't have to go back to your people, Axel said, trying to keep his voice steady. You're not bound by the throne anymore. You can make your own choice. Nissa's laugh was hollow. You think it's that simple? That I can just walk away from everything? From my people, my legacy, my responsibility? Her words stung more than Axel wanted to admit. He had his own demons, his own past full of mistakes and regrets, but hers seemed deeper. He understood what it was like to be bound by a life that wasn't of your own choosing, but he had the freedom to leave it behind, to abandon it. Nyssa, on the other hand, couldn't seem to sever those ties. Axel leaned forward, meeting her gaze directly. No one can force you to carry that weight, Nyssa. Not anymore. Not me. Not your people. You're free. You get to decide what comes next. She seemed to consider his words, her posture softening slightly. Freedom, she said quietly. What a strange thing it is. I've never known it. I've only known duty, duty to my people, my kingdom, my family. You don't owe them anything now, Axel said, his voice low but firm. You owe it to yourself to figure out who you are when you're not a princess. When you're just you. Nyssa's expression softened, and for the first time since Axel had met her, there was a flicker of something that might have been gratitude. Or maybe just understanding. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Axel was used to silence, it was a good companion on long journeys. But this silence was different. It was the kind that settled over two people who were figuring out just what it meant to trust someone else, to build a future from the wreckage of the past. Nyssa finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you want from me, Axel? He turned to face her fully, his heart inexplicably racing. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. Nothing, he said quietly, his voice firm. I don't want anything from you. I helped you because it was the right thing to do. And because I couldn't stand by and watch someone like you be sold. She stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, as if trying to decide whether or not to trust him. Then why am I still here? She asked softly. Axel looked out the window, the stars outside blurring into streaks of light. Because you have nowhere else to go, he said. And because maybe, just maybe, we both need a place to start over. Nyssa was silent for a long while, and Axel wasn't sure what she was thinking. But when she finally spoke again, her voice was soft, uncertain. Maybe. Axel exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing just a little. It's going to be tough, he warned her. Nothing's easy when you're starting from scratch. I know, she replied. But I'm tired of pretending I have it all figured out. Axel nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle between them. They were both adrift, both searching for something that neither of them could yet name. But at least, for the first time, they weren't alone. The hum of the ship's engines filled the quiet again, and Axel allowed himself a brief moment of peace. They didn't have all the answers. But they had each other, for better or worse. The journey through the vast reaches of the outer rim felt like a slow, steady march toward an uncertain future. Axel had always considered himself a master of navigating the unknown. But this was different. He wasn't just running from the law, or a bounty hunter, or some gang leader looking for revenge. He was running from the weight of an unspoken connection, the responsibility of protecting someone whose life had been shattered, whose trust had been earned and lost in a matter of hours. Nyssa had said little in the days that followed. She spent her time in the ship's small quarters, her body curled tightly against the wall as if she were trying to shrink away from the reality of her situation. Her silvery hair, once regal and flowing, now looked unkempt, tangled from days of disuse. The defiance that had once shone in her violet eyes was gone, replaced with an uncertainty that Axel could feel like a cold shadow. She wasn't used to this. The lack of purpose, the absence of responsibility, it was like a constant weight pressing on her chest. Axel knew that. She had been born into a life of power, surrounded by people who expected something of her. And now, everything had been stripped away, and she had nothing. Nothing but him. Axel couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he hadn't just freed her from the chains that had bound her body. He had freed her from everything, her entire identity, her sense of duty, her very reason for existence. And now, she had no idea who she was supposed to be. Axel sat alone in the cockpit, staring out at the endless sea of stars that stretched before him. The vastness of space seemed to mock him, as if reminding him that he was just a tiny speck in the grand scheme of things. A smuggler, a man who made deals and ran from consequences. But Nissa, she wasn't just any woman. She was a princess, a leader, someone who had once ruled an entire world. And now, she was here, with him, alone and uncertain. Axel, Nissa's voice interrupted his thoughts, soft yet filled with a quiet strength that had begun to surface again. He turned to see her standing in the doorway of the cockpit, her posture still stiff but no longer guarded. I need to know where we're going. What's next? He hesitated for a moment before responding. We're headed to a place called Galter Station. It's neutral ground, and there are people there who can help us lay low, get some supplies. Nissa's brow furrowed slightly as she stepped into the room, her eyes studying him. And what then? You said you were taking me to safety, but what does that even mean? Where can I go? What am I supposed to do now? Axel felt a pang of guilt twist in his stomach. He didn't have the answers for her. He wasn't a philosopher, or a leader. He wasn't even sure what he was anymore, other than someone who had made a decision to stand by her. And the more time he spent with Nissa, the more he realized that the consequences of that decision weren't as simple as he had hoped. He stood up slowly, crossing the room to face her. You can do whatever you want, Nissa. You're free now. No one's telling you what to do, no one's controlling you. You get to choose your path. She looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his eyes, some kind of assurance. Then, her expression softened, and she shook her head. I don't know how to choose, Axel. I've never had the chance. My life was never my own. Axel swallowed, the weight of her words settling heavily between them. Then we'll figure it out together. One step at a time. Nissa seemed to consider that, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she let out a quiet breath. I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore, she said, almost to herself. Not even you. Axel's chest tightened, but he didn't let the frustration show. He couldn't blame her for that. Her entire world had been built on lies, on betrayal. She had no reason to trust anyone, let alone him, a smuggler with his own agenda. I know, he replied softly. But I'm not asking for your trust. I'm asking for a chance. To prove that I'm not like the others. Her eyes met his then, and for the first time in days, Axel saw a flicker of something else, a hint of hope. She stepped closer, her expression still uncertain but more open than before. What if I don't want to go back to the Vardari? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if I don't want to be a princess anymore? Axel didn't have a ready answer for that. He hadn't considered it. Nissa was royalty, after all. She was born to rule, to command armies, to carry the weight of her people's hopes and dreams. To simply walk away from all of that, was it even possible? But Axel could see it in her eyes. She wasn't asking for permission. She was asking for a way out. A way to be free of the shackles that had bound her not just physically, but emotionally, for so long. I don't think you can ever really escape what you were, Axel said carefully, but you don't have to live by it anymore. You don't have to be the princess you were born to be. You can be whatever you want to be now. That's what freedom is. She studied him for a moment longer, and then, surprisingly, she smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. I'm not sure I'm ready for freedom, she said softly. But maybe I'm ready for something else. Something that's mine. Axel felt a flicker of something deep within him, something that was far more than just a passing sense of duty. Something he hadn't expected to feel. Something that made his heart race just a little faster. You'll figure it out, he said quietly. In your own time. Nissa nodded slowly. Then, as if to seal their unspoken agreement, she stepped toward him. Her body language was still guarded, but there was a softness in the way she moved, a hint of trust creeping back into her posture. Axel felt the tension between them ease, just a fraction. They were two people, lost in their own ways, but maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as they had thought. The stars outside the window seemed endless, and Axel couldn't help but think that the path ahead was just as wide, just as full of possibilities. It would be a long road ahead, filled with uncertainty and danger, but for the first time in a long while, Axel felt the stirring of something more. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't stuck either. The quiet hum of the Steel Dagger's engines was the only sound that filled the cockpit as Axel and Nissa continued their journey through the unknown. The stars outside seemed distant, like tiny pinpricks of light in a vast and empty canvas. Axel had never been one for sentimentality, but as he looked out at the void, he couldn't help but feel a sense of something, a shift, a change. The uncertainty that had loomed over them both for so long was beginning to feel like something they could confront together. It had been 3 weeks since they'd left Iskar Prime. 3 weeks of travel, of silence, of tentative conversations, and still, Axel wasn't entirely sure where they stood. They weren't exactly friends. They weren't even allies in the traditional sense. Nissa had made it clear from the beginning that she wasn't ready to trust him fully, and he hadn't expected her to. But there was a shift in the air, a sense that something was moving beneath the surface, something that neither of them could ignore. Nissa had spent most of her time on the ship in the small quarters she'd claimed as her own. She kept to herself, trying to find her footing in this new life, and while Axel could respect that, it was beginning to gnaw at him. She was still the princess, the one who had been born into power, and that part of her was harder to shake than either of them wanted to admit. She had been the one to take the first step. She had spoken to him first, when she asked what came next. But the truth was, they were both just trying to survive. They were both trying to make sense of a world that had been turned upside down, and neither of them had a map for where they were headed. Axel was pulled from his thoughts when the comm system buzzed, an alert flashing on the screen. He frowned, reaching for the controls to answer. "This is Axel," he said, his voice steady despite the sudden unease creeping into his chest. The voice that crackled through the comm was sharp, commanding, and unmistakably familiar. "Axel Cole," the voice said, cool and clipped, "this is Captain Ilya Moros of the Shadow Fleet. We have you on our radar. We need to talk." Axel's heart skipped a beat. The Shadow Fleet. The name alone was enough to send a chill down his spine. They were one of the most feared mercenary factions in the galaxy, known for their ruthlessness and efficiency. No one crossed them without paying the price. "What do you want, Captain?" Axel asked, his grip tightening on the console. There was a pause, and then Ilya's voice returned, colder than before. "You have something we need, Axel. Something valuable. And I'm here to collect." Axel's mind raced, his thoughts spinning. There was no way they could be after him, he wasn't the target, at least not directly. But the idea that they were coming for him, for Nissa, for something they didn't know about yet, it was enough to set every warning light in his brain ablaze. "Just tell me what it is you think I have," Axel replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "And I'll decide if it's worth giving up." Ilya's laugh was low, dangerous. "You think you have a choice? You don't, Axel. You've made a lot of enemies, and I'm not the only one who's coming for you." Axel's blood ran cold. "How do you know where I am?" "Let's just say we have our ways," Ilya answered, her tone filled with dark amusement. "You've got something that's worth far more than your life, Axel. And we're coming to collect. So, I suggest you don't try to run." Axel's pulse quickened, but he didn't allow the fear to show. He was no stranger to danger, and the idea that he couldn't outrun it didn't sit well with him. But there was one thing that gnawed at him, the mention of something he had that was more valuable than his life. The comm cut off abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Axel sat back, his mind spinning. Ilya Moros and the Shadow Fleet didn't deal in rumors or idle threats. If they were after him, it meant trouble, not just for him, but for Nyssa as well. He couldn't help but wonder what part she played in all of this. Why would they be after her? What could she possibly have that they wanted? Without thinking, Axel pushed away from the console and stood up, his gaze meeting Nyssa's across the room. She had been sitting quietly, as she always did, but now her eyes were fixed on him, an unreadable expression on her face. "Nyssa," Axel said, his voice tense. "We've got trouble." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind we can't outrun," Axel replied, his voice dark. "The Shadow Fleet is tracking us, and they know we're here." Nyssa stood up from her seat, her posture straightening. The calm, guarded exterior she had worn since he'd freed her was starting to crack, and Axel could see the fire in her eyes, the fire of someone who wasn't going to take things lying down. "The Shadow Fleet?" she asked, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. "Who are they?" "They're mercenaries. Some of the best, and the most dangerous. If they're after us, then we're in serious trouble." Axel moved to the controls again, his mind working quickly. "I don't think they're just after me, though. I think they're after you, too." Nyssa took a step forward, her gaze fixed on Axel. "Me? Why?" Axel hesitated. He hadn't fully pieced it together, but the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. It was her bloodline, her heritage, her status as a princess. There was no way a faction like the Shadow Fleet would come after him without a bigger reason. "I think they're after you because you're royalty," Axel said quietly. "Because you were once a princess of the Vardari. And now that you're free, well, that makes you a target." Nyssa's eyes darkened. "I'm not going back. Not to them, not to my people. I'll fight if I have to." Axel turned to face her, his hand on the ship's controls. He could feel the intensity of the moment pressing down on him. There was no running now, not from this. The Shadow Fleet was coming for them, and no matter how far they tried to hide, no matter how many jumps they made through the galaxy, they would find them. "We can't fight them alone," Axel said, his voice low. "But we don't have to. We've got options. And you've got something they want. Something they'll stop at nothing to get." Nyssa squared her shoulders, her expression resolute. "Then we make sure they don't get it." Axel met her gaze, feeling a strange surge of hope, an emotion he hadn't expected to feel in the face of danger. They might be running, but they were running together. And for the first time since Nyssa had stepped onto his ship, Axel felt a sense of clarity. They would face whatever came next, not as captor and captive, but as allies. The comm systems buzzed once more, an ominous reminder that their time was running out. Axel took a deep breath and gripped the controls, ready for the storm that was about to hit them head-on. "Let's get ready," he said, his voice steady. "We're not going down without a fight."